These are the books that if someone were to ask me who's never really read fantasy what's to read, I would recommend these books to them. Hey everybody, welcome to D3 Reads. I'm Eric and I want to know what your all-time personal favorite fantasy book or books are. I don't mean your favorite author, I don't mean your favorite series, I mean your favorite books. Let me tell you why I'm asking. Here in the next couple of days, I'm going to be going on vacation with my family. I do this every year. My wife and my son and I will go out, and we usually go backpacking or camping somewhere. And as I was planning out my video schedule, I started realizing that I was going to be out of pocket for at least a week, and that I would probably get a little bit of reading in, but not nearly as much as I normally would do in order to continue creating content for D3 Reads. And I started realizing that I was getting stressed out trying to figure out how to make this work. And I kind of had to take a step back, and I kind of told myself, you know what, this is fun. I think I made it clear that I have a blast making these videos. And if I'm turning it into something to stress me out, then I'm probably going down the wrong path. So that started made me thinking about the joy of reading. And for some reason, I just kind of landed on the fact that I haven't talked about fantasy in a while. And then but I have never made a video about my absolute favorite fantasy books. I have made a couple of videos. As a matter of fact, the very first video that we did on this channel was all-time favorite fantasy authors. And then we've done a couple since then. But I've never really shared my personal favorite books. And so that's what I'm going to do. These are the books that if someone were to ask me who's never really read fantasy what's to read, I would recommend these books to them. Because even though I've read lots of great fantasy, and if I'm not talking about your favorites, it's not because I think that they're bad or anything. It's just because these are the ones that have stuck with me over the years. And I would recommend to somebody who is just now getting into the genre. So with that, I'm going to share mine. I would love for you to tell me in the comments what your favorite fantasy books are, and if you'd like to share, why. The very first one is going to be just my favorite book of all time, which is J.R.R. Tolkien's The Fellowship of the Ring. Now, like I said, we're not going to be talking series here, because otherwise I'd definitely be sharing The Lord of the Rings. I have the whole series, of course, in a number of different printings. Matter of fact, I hunted these Valentine Books editions because they were the ones that I originally read back in the 80s, I think. So I have these printings specifically. I have the leather-bound volumes and all that. But again, if you were going to pin me down and ask me what my favorite Lord of the Rings or my favorite Tolkien book was, or my favorite fantasy book of all time, I would say it's The Fellowship of the Ring. Now, why not The Hobbit? Why not The Two Towers or The Return of the King? And I think the reason why, again, you're pinning me down on this, so I'm sharing the justification here is that, The Hobbit, of course, was just a delightful, creative, just fun fantasy that introduced us to the world of Middle-earth, or most of us to the world of Middle-earth, and Bilbo Baggins, and just that whole mythology that was just so fun that could be enjoyed by children and adults alike. But The Fellowship of the Ring is where Tolkien took that and made it and kind of created or solidified the world of Middle-earth for so many of us. The introduction of Frodo Baggins and his and the entire Fellowship to face down Sauron and the forces of Mordor, and ultimately in Saruman. I mean, the world just became so mature and complex with the introduction of Middle-earth through the Fellowship of the Ring, and it told us that we hadn't seen anything yet. And of course, it set the stage for what became just probably the most successful, vast, and widely read fantasy world of all time. So The Fellowship of the Ring is my absolute favorite of all fantasy books. So I'd like to hear how many of you share that opinion, and how many of you would say, no, it's not quite the best, and what that would be a better fantasy book than this. But yeah, The Fellowship of the Ring, my number one of all time. It's my GOAT. And I would recommend this to anybody who is trying to get into fantasy for the first time. Number two, now the others I won't say are my number 2, 3, and 4, but they are definitely the ones that, again, if I were to recommend a fantasy book to folks, these would be it. Now, the next one is going to be one that I had put off for years reading because I was, I think, misinformed about it. is George R.R. Martin's A Game of Thrones. I mentioned this in one of my previous fantasy videos, but A Game of Thrones, I resisted reading for a while because I thought that George R.R. Martin was just basically trying to copy J.R.R. Tolkien. I couldn't believe that the guy had two R's in his middle initials, and I thought that that was a dead giveaway and that this was basically going to be a chance to reinvent or just do a slightly stale kind of interpretation of a Middle-earth type of story. And of course, that was goofy of me and completely wrong. When I finally got around to reading it, I was blown away by the book. I loved how J.R.R. Martin took a fantasy world and introduced, and that has a lot of essential fantasy elements to it, but he really downplays the magic side of things, right? Now, magic only barely kind of sneaks its way in throughout various parts of it, and it's not the Gandalf Sauron type magic either. In addition, you have just the level of grittiness, the element. There's a realistic element to this that does not exist, I think, in the Lord of the Rings. You can feel the characters being a little bit more, I think, relatable and a little bit more gritty as they go through the trials of A Game of Thrones. So I really enjoyed this book. If someone were to tell me that they had tried the Fellowship of the Ring and they thought it was just, for whatever reason, not as engaging as they would have liked, I would then recommend J.R.R. Martin's A Game of Thrones. Of course, it's incredibly violent compared to The Lord of the Rings and more graphic sexual content, but this has definitely become one of my favorite go-to fantasy books of all time. Next on the list is a book I actually don't own a physical copy of, but it's Stormbringer by Michael Moorcock, part of the Elric of Melniboné series. I talked briefly about Elric in the very first video I did, and I think I was a little swept away by it when I first picked up the Elric of Melniboné book. I can't remember if I read the first one or if it was Sailor in the Seas of Fate. I forget which one that I read first so many years ago, but since then I read everything up to Stormbringer, I think, and I haven't read anything past that, but Stormbringer was my favorite. And, Elric is such a complex character. He's a prince of chaos. He's supposed to be a bad guy, essentially, but he turns out to be an anti-hero of sorts. His sword, Stormbringer, that devours the souls of those that he slays. It's just an amazing world that doesn't seem comparable to many other fantasy stories. So Elric, and the fact that he's such a complicated person, not only just with the conflict of chaos versus law and his role in fighting the forces of chaos that he comes from, but the fact that he's an albino and that he's sickly, and so he's kind of dependent on his evil sword for power. I mean, the whole thing is just such an interesting and mesmerizing kind of setup that I just really, really enjoyed the books. Now, I purchased this recently at a used bookstore. I was just perusing through some stuff, and I saw Elric at the End of Time, and I seized it. I was hoping to find more, but I never did. But I need to get Stormbringer and actually the rest of the series because it is such a really cool series. So again, if someone were to ask for a recommendation and they were a little bit looking for something a little bit different than the high fantasy type stuff you get with the Lord of the Rings and the gritty realism of A Game of Thrones, you're looking for something different, then I would recommend Elric of Melniboné, the series, and Stormbringer. I think that's like the 5th or the 6th in the series. But that one's my favorite because that really brings that relationship to a head between Elric and his evil sword, Stormbringer. So definitely one of my favorites. So I'd love to hear it if you have a favorite that's different of the Elric series. All right, next on the list. This is a really, really tough one because I'm going to be talking about Terry Pratchett and his Discworld series. Actually, my co-host, who has been out for a while but should be back sometime soon, Jeff and I did a video a few months ago about what we thought were the top 10 Discworld novels. And so I addressed this a little bit here, but I didn't want to pass up a chance to talk about my favorite Discworld books. And that's a hard thing to choose because every time I picked up a Terry Pratchett book, even the ones I thought, I don't know if this is going to be particularly good, it always blows me away. I mean, Terry Pratchett is was one of the most talented writers in fantasy, or I think at all. And it's really, really something that's, and his books have stuck with me for many, many years. My friends and I will quote Terry Pratchett just out of the blue for any number of scenarios or reasons, because it's just stuck with us so long. If I had to pick a favorite, it would have to be from the Night Watch series of his books. And so it would have to be, I would have to go with the absolute original, the Guards book, where we get introduced to Captain Vimes, we get introduced to Corporal Nobby, Sergeant Colin, Carrot. Oh my gosh, just so many classic characters. This is distilled. Oh, it is just pure humor. The characters are fun. The scenario is just hilarious. The story is just top notch. So I don't know if this would be the best Terry Pratchett book to start with, but I think if you've never read any Discworld, you could probably, but you are familiar with fantasy, I don't think you'd be thrown for a loop here. There are some of the elements of or the laws or rules that govern the world of Discworld you may have a question about here and there, but I mean, just absolutely one of my favorite, most cherished books I think of all time. Is Terry Pratchett's Guards, and I would recommend that to anyone, especially if you're looking for something funny and you just want something fantasy. And finally, the last book we're going to talk about is one I just recently read. I covered it in, I think, the top fantasy books according to Goodreads video that I did a couple of months ago, but it's The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. This book just impressed me so much that, again, I would gladly recommend it to anybody who's looking for fantasy in a somewhat unconventional sense. Now, this book has, swordplay. It's got thieves. It's got magic. It's got fantastic creatures, wizards, and all that kind of stuff. But it is a gritty kind of fantasy set in a world that's very much unlike the traditional fantasy settings of medieval Europe. In that, well, I guess you could say medieval Europe, but it's more along the lines of Venice, Italy. It's got a very strong Italian kind of setting, and it's just fascinating. I remember when I first started reading it, it just hit me that what was being done here as far as the setting, and it works so well. The character of Locke Lamora, are instantly connected to. I don't know. I just had this. I felt myself immediately invested in the character. He was so interesting. I won't say that he's completely out of the blue. I kind of I'm a little reminded of, say, the Grey Mouser for some reason, but Locke Lamora is such an interesting character that I got pulled into his story right away, and I was rooting for him. I would say it's more on a scale of Lord of the Rings on one side and Game of Thrones on this side. I would say it's more Game of Thrones-ish as far as the type of violence. I think I noted in a couple of book reviews that I was checking out on it that a couple of people were turned off by the level of violence, and it is violent, but it is an incredibly interesting book. It's fun to read, a little exhausting because, like I said, it gets kind of intense. I haven't read the other books in the series, but I can say that The Lies of Locke Lamora, if you're looking for a kind of grittier fantasy type world to explore, that's a great book to start with. A lot of fun, and I would recommend it to anyone. So that's it, guys. Those are my favorite fantasy books, I think, of all time. I would love to hear what yours are. So let me know. Drop in the comments your favorite fantasy books. And I'm open to any suggestions. If there's some that you've read that you think eclipse some of these. Now, of course, this is all personal opinion and what have you. I would really love to hear the books that are your favorites. So drop a comment, and thank you so much for your time. Have a great day. Keep reading.